Okay, I'm going to briefly talk as quickly as possible about how to wrong warp because I just did a video and I was not satisfied. I took way too long to explain it. So I'm going to just tell you how this works. So this is concerned simply with farores wind wrong warping, and really it's concerned and directed just towards people doing meme categories, because that's really all you do farores wind warp. Is if you're not trying to warp to the credits and you want to warp somewhere different, you're going to be using this method on farores wind. So after you get farores wind on B using whatever method you want to do, this is how you're going to figure out where you want to warp. The most important chart to look at is warp results by scene, because for most meme categories and other things like that, you're wanting to know what cutscene you're going to warp into, because essentially you don't really care about where you're warping to with these kinds of wrong warps. I mean, it's kind of cool, but when you have farores wind on B button, you probably don't care about warping into a location. You're most concerned with warping into a cutscene. So the really only two that we can do, because Death Hole stuff is kind of weird, are these two columns, which is Fire Temple, which is cutscene 3, and Deku Tree, which is and Dodongo's Cavern, which is cutscene 1. So how you do this is this: you're gonna look down either of these columns, and most prominently you're gonna be using this one here, because the Dodongo's Cavern one is much more lenient, and the Deku Tree one is much more lenient than Fire Temple. Plus, Fire Temple mostly crashes if you look at all this here. But there's some cool stuff you can do in there, like Door of Time opens is kind of neat. But really what you're going to do is you're going to pick what cutscene you want to load. So, for example, let's pick a cool one. Let's say, for whatever reason, you want to warp to the title screen demo of Bolero. Now, here's how you do this. You're going to first look at the far left. It's going to tell you where you need to warp into. So you know that's the location that you're going to warp to in order to load this specific cutscene. You're going to go to your entrance table, which is another index on ZSR. Both these are on ZSR. You're going to go and find that location. So the location is Death Mountain Crater. You're going to Control F. You're going to type in Death Mountain Crater. And now you're going to be looking at the left on these numbers here called hexadecimal, and you're going to be trying to figure out which one of these values is the one you're looking for. So now that you know you want to warp to Death Mountain Crater, you're going to find two things. You want one that is, you want to find Death Mountain Crater on the left, and you look above it and make sure that this is a place that you think you can get to quickly for your route, or you think that's like it's doable. And if it is, then you next look at the left value. Well, I guess you could do it in the reverse order, and see if it adds up. So essentially, to get this over to here so that you can warp from here to Death Mountain Crater, you need this value here, if you add 5 to it, to be equal to or lesser than this value. So for example, this would not work. It's too great. The value is much too high, so don't worry about that. It's gone forever. So now we have our next one here, which is Death Mountain Trail from Dodongo's Cavern to Death Mountain Crater. Now this value here on the right of the one you're trying to warp to doesn't actually matter. All that matters is this here, and these two values and whether it works or not. So this one will work. If you look at it, you're wanting to warp to Death Mountain Crater. We already know that because that's what's going to load that cutscene. So we're going to look above it. We're going to need to warp here from Death Mountain Trail. So that's where we're going to start placing our farores wind warp. And then you next look to the right to see where you need to be coming from to place that farores wind. That part's really important. So from what we know here, if we add 5 to this, it's going to equal 0247. And if we look down here, this is 0246. And the next value is in hexadec, which means it loops over. So this value is way too high. But this value, if you add 5 to the value before it, does fall within the parameter of that plus 5 value. So it means it will warp you here, because the game checks, it's going to check this next value here, and then it's going to look to the next one and see if it adds 5, is this value too great? And since it is, it's going to round back down, and it goes to the next value before it, which is this one, which does fall in that parameter. So it will warp you here. This is correct. So now that we know that, we're going to have to come out of Dodongo's Cavern to Death Mountain Trail, and then once we do that, you're going to place your farores wind warp at that location from Dodongo's Cavern coming out to Death Mountain Trail. And because of you have that there, when you wrong warp from Dodongo's Cavern or from Deku Tree, it will take you to Death Mountain Crater, which in turn, what it'll do is it'll take you here, and because you added 5 to it, it's going to be in this column here. It will play the title screen Bolero demo. It's guaranteed to do it. It 100% will work every time. And that's pretty much all there is to it. It's actually a very simple set of kind of things you need to do in order to get to work. I'm trying to think if there's anything important to kind of talk about with this, though. I think that's pretty much it. The principle behind what it's doing I can explain really briefly. So what the game is going to do is it looks at two things. Once you come out of the portal, and like it would normally warp you, the game looks at your entrance, which is where it's going to place you on the map, and then it looks at any cutscenes that are supposed to be played on the given location that you've gone to. And because you're manipulating that entrance value here to be somewhere different, the game then checks that new value of where you're supposed to be warping into, and then it plays the cutscene allocated with wherever you're warping into. Which in this case, since you're going to be warping to Death Mountain Crater, instead of, if you're leaving like Dodongo's Caverns warp, instead of like at Death Mountain Trail, it next goes to this one instead, and then it looks at this cutscene that you're supposed to be playing because of where you came from, and it plays this. So that's how that works. It always looks at those two places, which is why it's important to warp to a place like that, because sometimes if you try to wrong warp from a certain location, it will put you out of bounds because you're not in the map, because you are telling the game where you want it to place you when you set Farores Wind, and then the cutscene will just not play because you'll keep falling out of bounds infinitely and kind of soft lock the game. One last thing that you can do. Now, I said that it's plus 5 or greater. You add 5, and if it's equal or lesser to it, then it will warp you there. But if the value that's below is too large, it will always reference itself. So for example, say we wanted to warp from here, from Death Mountain Crater, from Goron City. So you come out of Goron City into Death Mountain Crater, you place the warp, and then what's going to happen? Well, since this value here is too high, it rounds itself back down to where you initially placed the warp, and it'll basically just take you to this exact location. So, and it'll do the exact same thing with the cutscene. So when you leave Dodongo's Cavern and Deku Tree, it's going to now take you here, because it can't go here because this value is too large. And then it'll look at again, like, okay, well, where are we warping to? Oh, Death Mountain Crater. And then it'll look again, oh, Death Mountain Crater. And it'll say, once again, title screen Bolero demo. So you can use that as a way to make it warp you to the location. Like, if there is no value in there that's going to get you to that location, you can just go to the actual place here and just place it there. You just have to make sure that you check the entrance table first, just in case the value is too small and then it goes over. But that's pretty much all there is to it. Just kind of experiment with it. It's really simple as long as you remember that, pick the location, the cutscene that you want to warp into, go to your entrance table, check where you need to place it at and where you're supposed to come from, and then just make sure that it falls within that value, and it'll work every time. So if you play around with that, it's actually pretty simple. I think just a little bit of practice and experimentation, you'll find it's very simple trick. So hope that helped.